I will be your moon, you will be my sky, and I promise I will follow you until the end of the line. And I will be your flower if you will be the bee. And I promise I will always give you the sweetest parts of me. 'Cause you're the tip to my top, the key to my lock, you're my breakfast in the morning, you're my up to my down and the king of my crown, and you're everything I want. You got that sweet, sweet honey, sugar, and I want it sweet, sweet honey. You got that sweet, sweet honey, sugar, and I want it sweet, sweet, sweet honey. So give it to me.
Welcome to Wicked. That stands for What You Can Do. And it is Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Let me tell you something. If you have only heard stories about this man from corporate media, your MSNBCs, your CNNs, etc., God help us, your foxes, then you won't have an accurate picture of the man. He is very much a misunderstood figure. People do not have an accurate picture of what he was like and what he advocated for, and I'd like to talk about his last battle and set the record straight today about who Martin Luther King really was and why he is one of my favorite Americans in history. In history. I'd like to show you something. That's Martin Luther King. Try to update this in modern terms. Imagine what would that look like today. Well, the cops would have those radios with the cords clipped on, maybe a body camera. Maybe instead of the suit with a tie, he'd be doing the two buttons down thing. Certainly no hat. Can you picture what a modern Martin Luther King would look like with that expression on his face, on the hood of a police car getting handcuffed? Actually, that's not a police car, that's a desk, but still. Can you picture what he'd look like? You take out the fame, I bet you've seen that image recently. Black Americans treated roughly. The fight goes on and on and on. But he was just a man, flawed person. He was not a perfect progressive, in my opinion. In fact, I don't believe there is such a thing as a perfect progressive. That is sort of what being progressive is all about. Always striving for better. The sad fact is, it's very easy to be a progressive these days because it's hard to get much worse than we currently are. Dr. King foresaw this, and it is evident in his latter speeches. He identified exactly what was wrong in America and exactly what we needed to do to fix it, and I'll give you a quick spoiler: we didn't do it. And we are regressing, as predicted. Let's go back to King. Who was he? To explain a little bit more about the true character of Martin Luther King, I'd like to introduce you to this gal, Claudette Colvin. She was 15 when she was arrested in Montgomery for refusing to give up her seat on the bus to a white person. 9 months before Rosa Parks did. Why weren't the bus boycotts focused around her? Happened 9 months earlier. Dr. King had a hand in that. He said, she's not it. He said a teenager is not a good person to make the figurehead of this. Had a rather rough comment about her skin as well. Rosa Parks had smoother skin, apparently. Is Dr. King secretly an awful guy? Nope. He knew his audience. He knew whose opinion he had to sway. He was a pragmatic man. More importantly, he was a tactical man. There was nothing spontaneous about the bus boycotts that became one of the turning points in American culture, where we started to take another direction. I want you to understand that Dr. King was capable of looking at a 15-year-old girl suffering and in jail. He was capable of looking at her and saying, she ain't it. We're going to wait for a better person to represent this movement, to represent this boycott. Not because I want you to think less of him, or more even. Just want you to know what his character was like. He was a moral man, but he was capable of making some cold-blooded decisions. Because, again, I stress, he was a strategist, and he understood what was necessary to accomplish his goals. It was a quality. When he died, he had a 75% approval rating. But what did Americans disapprove of? Was it all the same? Did everybody turn on him all at once? No, as a matter of fact. Let's go to Morning Joe. I've been waiting. I've been waiting for Joe Scarborough to annoy me. He's had a couple of appearances on this show. And, yes. Sorry about that. There we are. He's had a couple of appearances on this show. And it's frustrated me greatly because I've had to praise him. But I do want to stress that normally, I don't like this guy so much. Normally, I find that Joe Scarborough represents the kind of politician I grew up despising, who has his eyes open only when it's convenient and takes true facts and presents them in a way that is intentionally misleading, because they couldn't have been presented that way without the knowledge of what the truth was. And it frustrates me that the guy seems to get away with it. Let's jump right to it. I have all kinds of criticisms.
John, John Meacham, I've always been, like everybody, haunted by this speech and the words that rang out. I remember the first time hearing
He's talking about the mountaintop speech, I should clarify.
it was at First Baptist Church in...
right before King was killed, day before he was killed.
I think it was Doraville, Georgia. They played it for us. But I've always been haunted by him talking about Chambly, Georgia, haunted by the mountaintop, and the imagery that he gave Moses, not getting to the promised land, but seeing the promised land, and knowing that his people were going to get to the promised land. What was so remarkable about him talking about how longevity had a place, and he would hope for longevity, and saying it the night before he was assassinated, as you said, it's
not entirely relevant, but I have always wondered, did he have warnings? Like, were people saying, hey, we've got suspicious characters around here? Supposedly it was not supposedly, I shouldn't be weird about it. An escaped convict shot him. It was another example of King being extremely prescient, talking about the night before his assassination, talking about the fight going on without him. And credit where it's due, begrudgingly, Joe Scarborough is right about that. It is haunting.
Almost didn't give this speech. It was raining outside. It was miserable.
Yeah.
Talk about the lead up to one of the what you consider, and I think what most of us consider, one of the great speeches in American history.
It really is. It was, as you say, it was storming in Memphis, and he wasn't all that excited about going to the Church of God headquarters there to deliver this speech, deliver this sermon. Ralph Abernathy talked.
Quick side note, couldn't be anything that is a better demonstration of what I dislike about Joe Scarborough and the whole Morning Joe crew than having a rich white guy talk over King's speech rather than play it. But okay, fair enough. They have commercial breaks to get to, I guess.
Him into it. He said, they're here for you. Dr. King went, and we have these indelible words. And the words are indelible because of what happened the next day. But they're also, it's important, I think, when you look at the whole speech, it's a speech about economic justice. It's a speech about why he's in Memphis. He's in Memphis to support striking sanitation workers.
Okay, so right there. King's last speech was about economic justice, supporting striking sanitation workers. Could that not be a speech given today and be just as relevant? How ahead of his time this guy was, unfortunately, shouldn't have been. I wish, like so many others, we had more time with him, because we are still dealing with the problems of that era. We shouldn't. It makes me both ashamed to be an American and proud that he was an American. That he was talking about in the 60s issues and solutions to them that are relevant today. Our big issues should be, how are we going to expand our colonies to Mars? without losing any production in our factories on the moon. That's the kind of thing we should be talking about. What are we doing instead? Still, cops killing black people. Still, economic injustice. Still, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. Still. This man who's talking now, who looks like every vice principal in a suburb that I've ever seen, he is admirably on this show at least drawing attention to what King was actually talking about. Not just, oh, I like King so much. Let me not talk about why, because you'll find that I would have voted against him constantly. Joe Scarborough in his entire career would have voted against anything King was for. With few exceptions, I suppose. A few exceptions. But anything economic? Hell no. Getting more to that. Let's let this keep playing.
He is trying to take the dream to the next step. He's trying to get from opening access to making sure there's a path to prosperity for everyone. And
that phrase, he chose to go weird at the end there, a path to prosperity. All right, fine. But access. So think about healthcare access when politicians use that phrase. When a squirrely politician wants to not directly answer the question, are you for Medicare for all? They'll say, I am for access to healthcare for all Americans. Yeah, we all have access to a Corvette dealership. The issue is money, isn't it? I have access to a yacht club as long as I can buy a yacht. I have access to a stadium that plays Freddie Mercury on a loop on a hologram. If I have a couple $1,000,000 to spare to hire a crew to run it, to rent out the stadium, sure. I have access to those things. When we talk about the difference between pre and post King, the major accomplishment is access. Black people weren't even allowed to play the game before. Now they are. Unfortunately, they're playing with almost no chips. Makes it real damn hard to get ahead. To even catch up, it makes it very, very hard. That is the core of the problem we deal with today. And that's what King was talking about in the late 60s before he was killed.
The Moses imagery, as you note, is so amazing. Part of the Song of Moses in Deuteronomy is Moses says, remember the days of old, remember the years of many generations. Ask thy fathers, and they will tell thee, thy elders, and they will show thee. And that's what the King canon is. It's remembrance, not simply as a passive act, right? Today's not about, Dr. King's not about contemplating a statue and then going back to what we're doing anyway. It's remembrance in a biblical sense. It is an action.
I do want to point that out. It's not just about contemplating a statue and then going back to business as usual. Okay, let's just remember that he said that.
To remind us why we do what we do and what it should be.
And Reverend Al Sharpton, you remember, and yet you move forward and push forward the legacy. You're doing it
All right, just one petty slam. Also because I'm so on Sharpton, although I like him more and more these days. Maybe it's just by comparison. But anyway, glad to see that the ghost of Al Sharpton is joining them.
Today, later on this morning, with the President of the United States and civil rights leaders. I'm curious your thoughts as we play the mountaintop speech from Memphis. Where we were, where we are, and where we still need to go on this Martin Luther King Jr. Day.
I was 13 years old when Dr. King made that speech. I had just become youth director of his New York chapter, and because I grew up in New York, I was appointed youth director by Reverend William Jones and Reverend Jesse Jackson, and Jesse was there that night. And I remember when the next day, when we heard Dr. King was killed over the news, my mother, who was born and raised in Dothan, Alabama, started crying like it was a member of our family. And though I had seen Dr. King twice and had become part of the organization, I didn't understand why she was taking it like it was a cousin or uncle. And she said you would have had to grow up where you had to sit in the back of the bus like I did, or not drink at a water fountain, understand what Dr. King did. And I began under
Access, in other words. One half of the fight. But yeah, his mom grew up before black people even had access to the game.
understanding that what he saw from that mountaintop was an America that many of us didn't see as bad as our parents, but still saw from our parts being unequal. And he was saying he left a message for us to keep going until we got to the promised land. You must remember, Joe, in those days, the battle was there was some in the black community that were saying Dr. King had outrun his relevance, and the black power advocates were denouncing him. And he remained steady that I believe we can make it in America, we can do it nonviolently, we can change laws, and you have to stay the course. And as I've told you many times, his wife has had to kind of keep me on that path. Martin III, who will be with us today, co-chairing, and his wife has always reminded me, Mrs. King kind of kept us that were younger, next generation, that Martin not only believed in America, but he believed in the way we should change America.
Okay, so remember the first portion of this broadcast. If you missed it, went over Claudette Colvin, the other civil rights activist before Rosa Parks, who very easily could have had her role in the Montgomery bus boycott. King was part of the decision to say no, not her. And I listed the reasons he gave for it. They were callous. Why did we talk about that? For this moment right here. Other black activists at the time wanted to pursue, I'm talking late 60s, wanted to pursue some very different measures. I hesitate to say more radical, because when you're talking about the United States of America, there's few things more radical than going after the money. But King was a strategist. And most importantly, he understood the source of the problem. He understood, in my opinion, the way to beat it. We're going to get into that because this is what you can do. And the good news is, even though the problem has gotten worse, the solutions are easier now. But I just want you to keep in mind as we go into this next segment where I really strongly disagree with Joe Scarborough's commentary that he's going to give in a moment. Dr. King was not wishy-washy. He was strategic. That simple. He was not, by any means, a centrist. He simply knew what was necessary to win.
And that's what we're going to be talking about today.
Which would have involved getting the centrists on his side, by the way.
And that's what people ought to deal with on Martin Luther King Day. It's not a day to take off. It's a day to take on and turn America on to finishing the road for equal opportunity and equal protection under the law.
Sorry, got to jump in again. How sad is it that the work isn't finished yet? Very, in my opinion.
You know, John Meacham, I remember quite a few years ago, Tavis Smiley came on with his book, Death of a King. And I must say, I was shocked. Tavis laid it all out, a story that historians know, but that many of us forget.
Yeah.
How unpopular King was in his final years with many on the radical left and many inside the civil rights movement who didn't believe in moving forward peacefully, who believed there needed to be violence, there needed to be agitation.
Okay. And here we go. So, did they disagree about the goal or the means to achieving the goal? Joe Scarborough right there is implying that King was not on the radical left. King very much was. I'll give you a spoiler for the next section. King was a democratic socialist, by his own words, in America in the 1960s. Democratic socialist. King was the radical left. He simply had a disagreement about tactics. A lot of the young cats. I'll tell you, if I was a young man in 1960, whatever the hell, looking at a full lifetime of oppression, I can't be on a high horse and say I wouldn't have been down for extreme measures. Having the benefit of history, I now look at what has been effective over time. And I personally am of the belief that King had the best strategy. And in fact, to this day, the strategies he used are, when it comes to physically protesting and using economics against the capitalist system, best strategy. What I subscribe to. But don't let this punk confuse you. A disagreement. You and I are likely to have disagreements of the variety that King did with other radical leftists. Strategy, that's all. A disagreement in how to get there, not where they're going. King had a 75% disapproval rating before he died. Because he came out against the Vietnam War, and he started pushing for more than just access, but rather economic justice as well. So he lost the white people that were uncomfortable seeing kids getting mauled by dogs, picked on them by police on television, but didn't want to actually do the GD work of providing an economy that was of use to black people in a country that was built on their backs, quite literally. That is why he had the disapproval rating that he did. That is why there was people on the left that were counted among that disapproval rating. But the reasons for the disapproval were very different. On the right, it was the war as well as his general social justice struggles. The centrists didn't want to do all the work necessary by King's estimation. And when you started to get further left, then there was disagreements about strategy, but not the destination.
He was taking it from all sides, being critical of the Vietnam War, taking it from the right, not being violent and strident enough, taking it from the far left. And yet, he kept his head down, moved forward, kept talking about nonviolence resistance. History, of course, proved him to be right, proved him to be the indispensable man in the civil rights movement, the great figure that did more to move this country forward than, my God, anyone in American history when it came to civil rights.
Right, and you know, the danger is when you become a holiday, you become a homily. You become, at least in the popular mind, a...
Dude has good points, but he keeps losing me on how he phrases it. You become a homily. Who's that for? Does anybody raise your hand if you know what he means specifically? I get generally what he's going for, but Christ, man.
Simpler story than you really were. And Martin Luther King Jr. was this, Taylor Branch once referred to him as a second founding father. That what he did on Wednesday, August 28th, 1963, in the March on Washington, was he redefined for us American scripture that if you look around the Monumental Mall, Jefferson had started, Lincoln had improved on, and King argued for its full application. By the way, is there anything more American in monumental terms than Martin Luther King, that image right there, stares in perpetuity across at Thomas Jefferson across the tidal basin, and Jefferson stares back.
Jefferson stares back going, why did one of my employees get out? Jefferson had I believe, over 600 slaves. Not a good guy.
And that's in many ways the tension and the promise of the country.
That is, it's interesting when you say that, John. It's also interesting, and it's perfect, and that King, quite aware of Jefferson's many failings and quite aware that Jefferson was a slaveholder, King would use, just like abolitionists would use, Jefferson's words constantly.
True.
King,
fair enough.
Throughout his lifetime, would use Thomas Jefferson's words as both a sword and a shield to move the civil rights movement forward. Yeah. It's just remarkable.
All right, so even in a video where I am largely tearing into Joe Scarborough, I do want to be careful to give credit where it is due. And I think his assessment of King's strategy here is dead on, and it's something we can take a lesson from. All these principles America supposedly stands for. A big failing on the left is simply taking note of what we say as Americans, what the whole country says we believe in, and holding it up, using it as a rhetorical tool. You believe in safety in schools, and yet. You say you believe in safety in schools, and yet. You say you believe in the Constitution, and yet. So on and so forth. I'm intentionally not being specific here. Using just that rhetorical tool is so effective, and I think we should make it a habit to get used to it again. Simply reflecting the principles the person we are debating with says they hold.
Yeah, no, that's well put. Yes, I mean, that's the central claim of the movement was grounded in both sacred scripture and secular scripture. It was love thy neighbor as thyself, and it was that we should be the good Samaritan. You help, not least because it's the right thing to do, but because you might need help. And it was Jefferson's words from the summer of 1776. What King was saying to white America was, we didn't make this promise, you did.
Boom.
Live up to your promise. Boom. That was the claim. And it felt, to go to your question, it felt a little soft to people. The Reverend knows this far better than I do, but by the mid-1960s, 65, 66, you have this sense that Dr. King, John Lewis, they're the Sunday school version of the movement, right? It was sweet. It was, it did what it could, but nobody wanted to get hit in the head anymore. And in fact, John Lewis loses the chairmanship of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee to Stokely Carmichael in 1966, because John Lewis, who bore the scars of the movement, was seen as too accommodationist.
Okay, so I do want to give Al Sharpton the closeout on this. But first, quick commentary on that. The strategies that most reliably work for getting change done in the United States are not shock strategies. They're pressure strategies. A shock strategy would be one big event or a couple big events. Case in point, January 6th. That was a criminal shock strategy, but it was, that's a perfect example. Pressure works. Constant and light. I'm not saying intentionally go lighter than you can. I'm saying go only as hard in terms of the effort you're putting towards one of these causes as you can maintain over a long period of time. A big part of the reason why we stress the email writing here, making that a habit, is because number one, it's easy. Number two, you can do it often. A protest is difficult to arrange. Obviously, they happen. They happen quite a lot these days. But it is a massive organizing effort. And when you look at the efficiency of your energy, well, you absolutely should join with, for example, Black Lives Matter protests when they happen. If you're talking about what you can do regularly, what you can do to make yourself a major player in changing American politics, simply look for whatever thing you have the energy to maintain over a sustained amount of time. Yes, joining in with the marches when you can, when they exist, when they come about. But don't wait for them. You got emails you can write about these issues, particularly when it comes to economic issues. Let's let Al Sharpton finish this out, because then I want to show you what Dr. King's politics were in his own words. I know, it's a novel idea, but it doesn't get done, and especially in a show like this, where they don't even play the man's speech. I'm sure they did at one point. I'm taking this clip in isolation, but you do not hear frequently about King's politics from King.
And the complexity of King, it seems to me, is that he remained devoted to nonviolence, not only as a tactic, but as a way of life. But let's be very clear. The claims in 1968 was not simply about, hey, let's all get along. It was about economic justice. It was about creating genuine reform. And genuine reform is not easy. It requires sacrifice. It requires a sense that we are, in fact, all in this together. And if you read that speech from April 3rd, you will see him calling out companies that he thinks should be boycotted. You see him talking about hard things, which is what prophets do.
Yeah. Rev?
I think Meacham hit it correctly. The tension, and again, I was just entering my team, and I'm in the North. The tension in the movement was it was not popular in New York to be with Dr. King's movement, because those that were more strident and more for violence or self-defense were saying that has run its course. And Dr. King's position was a real prophet stands up even to his own. You're not.
Also want to point out what else is in New York. The center of industry. I don't want to go into the entirety of the different sides to the left in late 1960s America, but that is a factor. In New York, you are in an area that is very big business friendly, whereas in the South at the time, it was easier to find folks that weren't reliant upon these major corporations.
Tested until you can be ridiculed by your own and stand up anyhow. If you talk about Moses at the banks of the Red Sea, it was the children of Israel that turned on him and said, "Did you bring us out here to die?" And that's when the miracle of the Red Sea opening happening. If you can't go beyond, and this is what Mrs. King tried to teach me, and Martin III keeps me on course, is that if you can't take the heckles of the crowd, we're going through it now with some that call themselves woke. If you can't take that, you will never be what you should be in terms of trying to move the country forward. It's easy to fight your adversary. It is more difficult to withstand the attacks of those that are your allies and stay the course anyway. And Dr. King exemplified that.
Okay, so Reverend Sharpton let me down in the end. It's the standard move for these folks to do their best to try to make King seem like they are on the same side. Very much not so. Now, coincidentally, oh look, I'm a progressive. Here I am saying, no, he agreed with me. Fair enough. Let's just have a look at what he said, what Dr. King said he believed in. Go back to 1952 when a 23-year-old, this is by In These Times, a really interesting online publication, left the link in the description, of course. A 23-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. wrote a love letter to Coretta Scott, not long before, or soon to be Coretta Scott King. Along with coups of affection, yada, 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 he described his feelings not just towards his future wife, but also towards America's economic system. This is 1950. He's like a freshman at this point. I am much more socialistic in my economic theory than capitalistic, he admitted to his then girlfriend, concluding that capitalism in 1960s America, concluding that capitalism has outlived its usefulness. Still true in 2023 America. In fact, I dare say that milk has spoiled. As Americans honor King on his birthday, they wrote years ago, further depressing your old pal Jake, it is important to remember that the civil rights icon was also a democratic socialist, committed to building a broad movement to overcome the failings of capitalism and achieve both racial and economic equality for all people. And this is where the strategy talk really comes in. Why are we dealing with the same problems we were dealing with in the 60s? Why is it white folks and black folks can't seem to get along? You get two kids in school together, you know, when they're young, before they've had a chance to be just ruined by our society. They don't really care about skin color. You ever see that heartbreaking and adorable video of a white kid and a black kid, and they're dressed the same and they're chuckling? And one of their moms, I don't know who, asks them, what's so funny? What are you guys up to? And they say that they're pranking their class when they go to school today because they're not going to be able to tell who's who because they're dressed the same. So it's an outside force that is causing these problems. Dr. King, in my opinion, correctly identified that all of this ugliness is a symptom, not the cause. The cause, economics. Greedy people relying upon us burning up all of our energy fighting each other, not realizing it is us versus them. Good news is, if you're a progressive, you more or less get it. It is defensive if you're progressive. We are not the aggressors. But we do have to recognize that if we want to end this fight, the target, it ain't the people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. It's the people who convinced them that their enemies are black people, brown people, and gay people. The people who profit off of giving them somebody to hate, instead of stopping and thinking about what is actually causing their woes for 5 minutes. And incidentally, it's the only way black people are going to get a fair shake in this country, is if we stop worshiping the rich and giving everything to them that we possibly can, and instead treating them like we ought to treat them, which is as people who have taken more from society than they have given. Definitionally, if you are rich, that is what you are. You should not have luxuries. I'm talking true luxuries, mansions and yachts. If there are kids starving in the U.S., which there are, you look at the COVID school lunches debacle, it's because so many children were reliant on lunches from school that when school shut down, there was a serious concern over children starving to death in the U.S. We should have busted in to whatever local yacht clubs existed, confiscated the yacht, all the yachts, melted them down, sold the scrap, and used that to pay for school lunches for every single kid that needed one. You can't have that kind of luxury in a country where people are starving to death. It's just not right. And in order to keep that luxury, we are turned against each other. So, let's look at the rest of this letter. Capitalism, King said, has brought about a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes, he wrote in his 1952 letter. He would echo the sentiment 15 years later in his last book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Capitalism has often left a gap of superfluous wealth and abject poverty, and has created conditions permitting necessities to be taken from the many to give luxuries to the few. Okay, that's a much more elegant way of saying that. Yeah, the thing that continually depresses me and yet also inspires me, this was written in the 60s. Man, 1967, he writes that. How have we not learned the lesson yet? We keep having the same fights over and over and over and over, and it's because we've made as much progress as we can under the current system. The current system, which relies on capitalism for everything. Current system can only go so far as allowing people that cursed word, access. Not equality. You have access to Arnold Schwarzenegger's weights. Doesn't mean you can lift them. Let's go a little bit more forward in time here. In his famous 1967 Riverside Church speech, King thundered, "When machines and computers profit," my God, the 60s, "profit motives and property rights are considered more important than people. Hello, landlords, during the housing crisis that we are experiencing. The giant triplets of racism, materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered. I'm going to keep plowing through this before I say a curse word. In 1968, King described his work with the Southern Christian Leadership, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference this way. In a sense, you could say we are engaged in the class struggle. Speaking at a staff retreat of the SCLC in 1966, King said that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth in the country. Maybe, he suggested, America must move toward a democratic socialism. Title of this stream, and possibly the VOD, is King's Last Battle. He got about as far as he estimated he could get when it came to fighting for access. Basically won that fight, and then saw that it wasn't enough. As he described it, it was a foothold. But because we have since failed to continue on that fight, we keep slipping. Every time a little progress is made, we go back. And it keeps getting worse. In King's time, corporations could not bribe politicians legally. Buckley versus Vallejo, 1976, 75, that area. That changed. Then again in Obergefell. What was it? 30 years after that. We keep slipping. Corporations keep getting more power, and these racial issues are never going to end so long as it profits somebody in the country to keep us fighting each other. Good news in that is that we have a clear goal. Remember that King picked very specifically Rosa Parks. I shouldn't say it was him alone. There was a committee. But nonetheless, his support went to her. Not because he liked one of these people more than the other that got arrested, but because he was being strategic about who he needed to convince in order to achieve the goals he wanted. Let's take a page out of that. We've got to be strategic. Who should you be going for? Let me give you a hint. Matt Gaetz. I want to see him in prison, for the record, and I'm going to work real hard to make that happen. But an interesting fact that I like to bring up on here a lot is he is against corporate donations in politics. He's against that. I don't care what his reasons are. But he knows that his base is okay with that. Poor white people. Those are potential allies in this fight. Good people? No. If they were voting for MAGA? No. But allies in this. Enemies of our enemy. Those are the bridges we should be building. We have to take up King's last battle. It ain't over. I don't know how we've survived, but it's only been paused. So quick recap of King's timeline of his beliefs here. In college, he's talking about an interest in socialism. By 1966, he's speaking at a staff retreat. He's organizing with his staff how to do this. Earlier, he had advocated, I think as early as 61, he had advocated for an early version. But by 66, he's getting organized with it. By 67, he's speaking about it publicly. In Where Do We Go From Here, King advocates for policies in line with a democratic socialist program, a guaranteed annual income, constitutional amendments. A guaranteed annual income in the gap between Martin Luther King and now, or in the modern era. How long was it before we heard that even brought up again? The 2020 primaries, when Andrew Yang, a politician I largely disagree with, a guy who is as ineffective with strategy as King was effective, but nonetheless was right on one point. We didn't hear about it until the 2020 primaries. My God. But there it is up there. We had to rediscover the answer because it left our cultural memory. But King was on it from the start. He endorses, guaranteed annual income, constitutional amendments to secure social and economic equality. I will read up more on those. Until this specific article, I was unaware of his talk of constitutional amendments regarding economic equality, but that's fascinating. I will look at specifically what the man was talking about. And greatly expanded public housing. I don't know if this is still true, but at one point the largest air force in the world was the United States Air Force, and the second largest air force in the world was the collection of planes belonging to the United States Navy. That is how much of a military budget we have. If we would just be satisfied with only having the largest air force in the world instead of the largest and the second largest, I'm pretty sure we could effing afford expanded public housing. But again, who gets all torqued up to say give more money to the military? The far right base. These are the people we have to start convincing. Because that's where victory is going to come from. Doesn't matter if you like it. It's irrelevant if you like it. We have to start formulating arguments that will sway these people. That is going to be the topic of an upcoming stream. However, it would behoove you, in studying what you can do, to think about not necessarily what currently appeals to these people. Because frankly, it'll be disgusting. No, think about what could appeal to these people. Look at what their actual problems are. Not what they say they are, but what their actual problems are. And go based off that. I'm going to actually get through this paragraph. He endorses the freedom budget put forward by socialist activist A. Philip Randolph, which included such policies as a jobs guarantee, a living wage. Oh, isn't that crazy? And universal health care. In 1967, universal health care. That prescience, that understanding of what America needed, that is why I admire Dr. King so much. That is why he is still, decades and decades later, a great role model for anyone who wants to organize and actually get stuff done. He also outlines how economic inequality can circumscribe civil rights. While the wealthy enjoy easy access to lawyers and the courts, the poor, however, are helpless, he wrote. And isn't that just exactly what's wrong with America today? King's last battle, we didn't fight these. He got killed when he was trying to help us. The end result is that we are regressing. The end result is we still have black folks, understandably and frankly, practically nervous when they get pulled over. They got to cross their fingers and hope the officer who's just told them to pull over is among the 19 out of 20 good ones and not that 1 in 20 who's going to decide for no damn reason that they're going to do something evil. We're regressing because we did not address King's last battle. Because multi-billion-dollar media companies, such as the one we just played for you, have an interest in only keeping our focus on the side of Dr. Martin Luther King that is convenient to them. The equal access side. Those things that they say about him regarding his organization around purely racial issues, those are true. And that's kind of why it's so insidious. Because you think you're hearing the whole truth, and you're not. I've left links to the article that I found summed this up best. You can read for yourself what Martin Luther King's opinions were. All that work he did, he made a point of saying, would be in vain if we did not also attend to the economic side. So let's attend to the economic side. But to close it out, Martin Luther King Day, why don't we hear it from the man himself in the last speech he ever gave? One Joe Scarborough talked about, which addresses exactly this.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy to tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.